Imagine walking into an airplane hangar tomorrow, handing over a stack of cash, and being handed the keys to a twin-engine aircraft. You have 0 flight hours. You have never taken a single lesson. You do not even know what half the instruments on the dashboard do. But since there is no law stopping you, you just climb into the cockpit, pull a lever, and launch into the sky directly over a densely populated city. Sounds completely insane, right? Well, that is exactly what the reality of driving was like for the first few decades of the automobile's existence. Until 1903, there was absolutely no such thing as a driver's license anywhere in the United States. You bought a 2-ton machine of heavy steel and combustion, and you just drove it right out into streets packed with playing children, horses, and pedestrians. And here is the part most people completely miss. Even when Massachusetts and Missouri finally invented the very first driver's licenses in 1903, they did not require you to take a driving test. The government did not actually care if you knew how to drive. So how did a piece of paper that was originally just a glorified tax receipt transform into the ultimate mandatory identification card that tracks your every move today? To truly understand why the concept of a driver's license didn't exist for the first few decades of the automobile, you have to mentally bulldoze the modern American street. Today, when you look out your window, you see a highly structured, strictly enforced environment. You see painted lanes, crosswalks, synchronized stoplights, and a legally enforced hierarchy where the multi-ton car is the absolute king of the asphalt. But in the late 1890s, the street was something entirely different. It was essentially the Wild West mixed with a crowded public park and an open-air marketplace. The street was a shared public commons. The concept of jaywalking did not even exist because the street belonged to everyone equally. Children played stickball right in the middle of the busiest avenues. Vendors sold hot pies and newspapers from heavy push carts parked wherever they pleased. Stray dogs roamed freely, and thousands of horses pulled streetcars and private carriages, leaving behind hundreds of tons of manure on the cobblestones of cities like New York and Chicago every single day. It was a chaotic, incredibly noisy symphony, but it worked perfectly. It worked because everything in that environment moved at the exact same organic pace, the speed of muscle. Humans and animals can only run so fast, and more importantly, they both possess a natural instinct for self-preservation. A horse, no matter how spooked, will actively try not to trample a child. People moved intuitively. If you were walking, you simply dodged the draft horse. If you were driving a carriage, you shouted at the pedestrian. And there was something deeper at play here, too. The legal philosophy of the era was rooted in radical personal liberty. The United States was built on the sacred idea of freedom of movement. The government had never regulated who could ride a horse or walk down a dirt road. Traveling was considered a basic, unalienable human right, not a conditional privilege granted by a local bureaucrat. Then, roaring into this perfectly balanced ecosystem, came the early automobile. These cars were completely alien to the human experience. They were deafeningly loud, spitfire, and choking black smoke. And most importantly, they lacked a brain. A car will not stop unless you physically force it to stop. In the beginning, these machines were essentially dangerous toys exclusively reserved for the ultra-wealthy, like the Vanderbilts and the Astors. So, when these rich daredevils started tearing down the muddy avenues at the blistering, terrifying speed of 15 miles per hour, they were viewed as absolute terrors by the general public. Think about how you would actually learn to drive in 1898. How did that process even work? There were no driving schools, there were no standardized instruction manuals, and certainly no empty parking lots to safely practice in. You basically bought this loud, vibrating contraption directly from an eccentric inventor or a former carriage maker. The seller might spend 10 minutes showing you which heavy brass lever made the machine go forward and which lever made it abruptly stop. And then you were completely on your own. You learned through very expensive error. You learned by stalling out in the thick mud, crashing into wooden fences, and terrifying the local livestock. And here is a crucial detail that made this learning curve incredibly dangerous. The mechanical controls were not standardized in the slightest. Today, you can get into any rental car and know exactly where the gas and brake pedals are. In 1898, it was a mechanical free-for-all. Some cars had a recognizable steering wheel, but many others had a tiller. That was a long metal stick that you pushed left and right to turn the wheels, like steering a small boat. The pedals were arranged in completely random orders depending on who built the machine. If you bought a steam-powered car from one manufacturer, you had to completely relearn driving if you bought a gas-powered car from another. You were essentially taking an unproven, highly experimental piece of heavy machinery and test driving it in the middle of a crowded pedestrian plaza. The people suffering the consequences of this steep learning curve were almost never the wealthy drivers heavily padded in their leather seats. The victims were the pedestrians and children who had lived in harmony with the street for decades. They were suddenly being violently invaded by metallic monsters piloted by absolute amateurs with more money than experience. The social tension was brewing fast. How long could a society allow untrained individuals to pilot heavy machinery through crowds just because they could afford to buy it? It was a ticking time bomb, and it was only a matter of time before the blood started to spill. The breaking point for this fragile, chaotic ecosystem didn't happen in a stuffy courtroom or a quiet legislative chamber. It happened directly on the unforgiving pavement of New York City on September 13, 1899. A 68-year-old real estate dealer named Henry Bliss was simply going about his normal day. He stepped off a crowded streetcar at the busy intersection of West 74th Street and Central Park West. As he turned around to assist a woman who was stepping off right behind him, a heavy electric taxicab, driven by a man named Arthur Smith, suddenly surged forward. The heavy machine struck Bliss, knocking him violently to the cobblestones and crushing his chest and skull. Henry Bliss died the following morning. He holds the grim historical distinction of becoming the very first recorded automobile fatality in the Americas. Here is the thing that really reveals exactly how society initially viewed this new technology. Arthur Smith, the driver, was immediately arrested and charged with manslaughter by the local police. But he was later released without major consequence. The judge essentially ruled that Smith had absolutely no malicious intent. It was publicly framed as just a tragic, completely unavoidable side effect of this new, unstoppable wave of modern technology. The legal system simply did not know how to handle a machine killing a man, so they treated the car exactly like a horse that had unexpectedly kicked someone. But the general public did not see it that way at all. The violent death of Henry Bliss ignited a massive, unprecedented firestorm of public outrage. Newspapers across the country ran highly sensational headlines, loudly labeling these new machines as devil wagons and the rich man's toy of death. People were furious that their safe, shared public spaces were being violently hijacked by wealthy amateurs testing out highly dangerous toys. And this is where it gets incredibly interesting, because the loudest pushback wasn't actually coming from terrified pedestrians in the dense cities. The rural conflict was far more vicious and highly organized. Imagine being a struggling farmer in the year 1900. Your entire livelihood depends completely on horses and the ability to transport your goods safely on quiet dirt roads. Suddenly, a roaring, fire-spitting metal box comes tearing through your quiet town. It spooks your horses, causes expensive carriages to flip into deep ditches, and violently disrupts your entire way of life. Farmers absolutely despised automobiles with a burning existential passion. In places like rural Pennsylvania, the deep-seated anger reached a boiling point. Organizations literally calling themselves anti-automobile societies started popping up all across the American countryside. These were not polite, suited lobbying groups writing strongly worded letters to their local congressmen. They were essentially angry, decentralized local militias trying to physically protect their dirt roads from the invasion of wealthy city drivers. They would go out in the dead of night and dig deep, hidden trenches across the main travel paths. They would bury sharp saw blades and heavy broken glass in the deep mud specifically to shred early rubber tires. They would gather at blind intersections and throw heavy rocks at passing drivers. The hatred was so intense that some local municipalities started proposing and officially passing laws that read like pure, unadulterated satire to us today. For instance, there was a real piece of legislation heavily debated in Pennsylvania, stating that if a driver of an automobile saw a team of horses coming down the road, the driver was legally obligated to pull their car off the road entirely. But it didn't stop there. If the horses still appeared spooked, the driver was required by law to immediately dismantle the automobile on the spot and hide the metallic pieces in the nearby bushes until the horses had safely passed. It sounds completely absurd to us now, but it perfectly illustrates the absolute desperation of a society trying to aggressively fight back against a machine they never asked for. The political pressure on local and state governments was mounting to a crushing weight. Innocent citizens were dying in the streets, valuable personal property was being destroyed daily, and the once peaceful rural dirt roads had turned into literal battlegrounds. The authorities quickly realized they had to do something, anything, to rein in this escalating chaos before it sparked a full-blown class war between rural farmers and wealthy urbanites. But lawmakers faced a massive, almost insurmountable philosophical problem. The United States was built from the ground up on the fundamental idea of freedom of movement. Historically, the government had never ever regulated who was allowed to ride a horse, drive a carriage, or walk down a public road. Traveling was considered a basic, unalienable human right. So, how could a local politician legally look a free citizen in the eye and tell them they were suddenly not allowed to operate their own legally purchased private property on a public thoroughfare? Politicians were absolutely terrified of overstepping their constitutional bounds, but they were equally terrified of the rising body count and the angry mobs of organized farmers. They desperately needed a middle ground. They needed a way to hold bad drivers financially and legally accountable without explicitly banning the technology or infringing on the constitutional right to freely travel. They slowly realized that the real issue wasn't just the danger of the machines, it was the absolute anonymity of the drivers. If a wealthy driver ran over a pedestrian or crashed through a wooden storefront, they could simply hit the gas and vanish into the night. Nobody knew who they were, and cars didn't even have license plates yet. The authorities severely needed a system of strict identification. They needed a government registry. And above all else, they desperately needed to generate rapid revenue to fix the muddy roads that these massive, heavy machines were tearing apart. The solution they finally landed on was the driver's license. But if you were magically transported back to 1903 to get one of these very first licenses, you would barely recognize the process. In 1903, Massachusetts and Missouri became the very first states to officially mandate a driver's license for automobile operators. New York quickly followed suit. But here is the part most people completely miss when looking back at this era. They did not actually test you. There was absolutely no written exam assessing your knowledge of the law. There was no rudimentary vision test to see if you could even spot a child running into the street from 50 feet away. And there was certainly no nervous driving instructor sitting next to you with a clipboard, asking you to parallel park on a busy avenue. If you wanted a driver's license in Massachusetts in 1903, the process was astonishingly, almost comically, simple. You simply walked into a local government clerk's office, filled out a basic piece of paper with your legal name and home address, and handed over $2. That was the entire process from start to finish. You were officially a licensed driver. The state did not care if you were blind in one eye. They did not care if you were 12 years old, or if you had literally never sat behind the steering wheel of a motor vehicle in your entire life. As long as you had the $2 fee in your pocket, you were granted the license, and they didn't hand you a nicely laminated card with a photograph to slide into your leather wallet either. The earliest licenses were often just small, stamped metal tags. They looked heavily reminiscent of the aluminum tags you would pin to your heavy winter coat if you were getting a hunting license. The government simply wanted your name recorded in a thick, dusty ledger. Why? Because before the license existed, a driver could run over a pedestrian, crash into a wooden storefront, and just hit the gas, speeding away into the night. Nobody knew who these wealthy drivers were. Cars did not even have standardized license plates yet. The driver's license was purely an administrative tool designed for legal and financial accountability. If you were caught causing havoc on the public streets, the local police finally had a legal mechanism to look you up, find out exactly where you lived, and issue a heavy fine. It was a basic registry, not a certification of mechanical competence. Did paying a $2 fee magically grant you the spatial awareness to navigate a bustling intersection? Of course not. It was a receipt, proving you had submitted to the local authority. For a brief, fleeting moment, this rudimentary system seemed to appease the angry public. It provided a comforting illusion of control over the metallic beasts tearing through their neighborhoods. But it was a paper-thin illusion. Merely issuing a piece of paper or a metal tag to a wealthy amateur does not magically transform them into a skilled, attentive driver. The fundamental problem, that uneducated people were operating dangerous machinery, had not been solved at all. It had merely been heavily taxed. As the first decade of the 20th century rolled on, the situation on American roads was about to violently shift from a high society nuisance to a full-blown national catastrophe. Because in 1908, an ambitious man named Henry Ford formally introduced the Model T to the world. Ford did not invent the automobile, but he did perfect the moving assembly line that made it astonishingly affordable. The price of a Model T eventually dropped to a point where farmers, factory workers, and everyday citizens could suddenly afford to buy a multi-ton machine. Suddenly, the car was no longer a luxury toy reserved strictly for the Vanderbilts and the Astors. It became a practical, everyday tool for the rapidly growing middle class. The number of vehicles on the road skyrocketed from a few thousand scattered across major cities to hundreds of thousands in just a few short, chaotic years. The streets, which were already buckling under the weight of early traffic, completely collapsed under the crushing weight of mass motorization. Accidents did not just increase, they multiplied exponentially across the nation. By 1913, the daily death toll on American roads was nothing short of horrifying. Thousands of people were bleeding out on the cobblestones and rural dirt roads every single year. The naive, purely administrative pay $2 and drive model was failing spectacularly. The government authorities looked at the rising body count, looked at the flooded streets, and realized a grim truth. Identifying bad drivers only after they had already killed an innocent pedestrian just was not enough anymore. If society was going to survive the era of the automobile, they had to figure out how to stop incompetent people from getting behind the wheel in the first place. As the death toll climbed and the streets transformed from shared public spaces into highly dangerous mechanical arteries, a fundamental realization began to dawn on local authorities. The initial solution, forcing drivers to pay $2 for a stamped metal identification tag, was essentially the equivalent of putting a tiny adhesive bandage on a massive bleeding arterial wound. It did absolutely nothing to prevent the crashes. It only helped identify the bodies and the culprits after the dust had settled. If society was going to survive this rapid mass motorization, they did not just need a government registry of names. They needed an entirely new physical operating system for the road. They needed standardized human behavior. And the man who stepped out of the shadows to completely reinvent the concept of global traffic is one of the most fascinating, deeply ironic figures in modern history. His name was William Phelps Eno. Eno was not a politician, and he certainly was not an automobile manufacturer. He was a highly educated, exceptionally wealthy businessman living in New York City, and he was profoundly disturbed by the absolute anarchy he witnessed outside his window every single day. Eno would stand on the safe confines of the sidewalk and watch as massive horse-drawn carriages, aggressive delivery wagons, and heavy new motor vehicles completely gridlocked the major intersections. There were no lanes. There were no designated crossing areas. It was just a screaming, honking, violent mess of wood, flesh, and steel, with absolutely no one knowing who legally had the right of way. The traffic jams in New York had become so legendary and so tightly gridlocked that sometimes it took hours just to move a single city block. Eno looked at this terrifying chaos and decided to take it upon himself to create mathematical, structured order. In 1903, he sat down and wrote a comprehensive, meticulously detailed manual titled Rules for Driving, which was quickly adopted by the New York Police Department. It became the very first formalized traffic code in the history of the world. The things you see outside your window right now, the basic geometry of the modern commute, were almost entirely invented by this one man. William Phelps Eno is the specific reason you are legally required to stop at a stop sign. He invented the concept of the painted pedestrian crosswalk. He originated the idea of the one-way street to clear up narrow, congested alleyways. He designed the first taxi stands, and he created raised pedestrian safety islands in the middle of wide, dangerous boulevards. He even formalized the strict, non-negotiable rule that all vehicles must pass each other on the right side. He looked at the organic, messy flow of the 19th century street and ruthlessly applied 20th century industrial logic to it. But there is one almost unbelievable detail about the man who single-handedly designed global traffic safety. William Phelps Eno never learned how to drive. Not once in his entire 86 years of life. He never held a steering wheel. He never pressed his foot down on a gas pedal. And he certainly never went down to the local clerk's office to obtain a driver's license for himself. Eno was fundamentally a man of the old world. He loved riding horses, and when he absolutely needed to travel by car, he vastly preferred to sit in the plush back seat and let a hired chauffeur handle the dirty work. The individual who dictated exactly how millions of people should operate a motor vehicle viewed the physical act of driving as something entirely foreign, almost beneath him. Yet, because he observed the chaos from the outside, Strictly as a pedestrian and a passenger, he was able to clearly see the larger systemic patterns that the terrified drivers could not. However, as brilliant as Eno's structural rules were, they quickly exposed a fatal, glaring flaw in the government's approach to the automobile. You can paint all the bright white crosswalks you want. You can erect hundreds of stop signs at every major intersection, and you can mandate one-way traffic until you are blue in the face. But if the people operating the machines physically do not understand how to use their brakes, or if they lack the basic hand-eye coordination to turn the steering wheel in time, all of Eno's brilliant rules are entirely useless. A stop sign is just a piece of metal if the driver approaching it does not know how to stop the car. This dark realization hit the state of New Jersey incredibly hard, leading to a watershed moment in American history. In 1913, exactly 10 years after the first $2 licenses were issued, New Jersey made a radical, unprecedented decision that would alter the course of American freedom forever. State officials looked at the rising death toll, they looked at Eno's complex new traffic laws, and they firmly decided that simply collecting a fee was no longer enough. New Jersey became the very first state to require a mandatory physical driving test before issuing a license to a citizen. You actually had to prove to the government that you knew what you were doing. You had to practically demonstrate that you could steer the vehicle, apply the heavy brakes, and navigate around physical obstacles without killing anyone in the process. It sounds like basic, undeniable common sense to us today, but you have to understand that in 1913, this was viewed as a massive, hostile infringement on personal liberty. People were completely outraged by the mandate. The idea that a government-appointed agent could legally sit inside your privately owned vehicle, judge your physical ability to operate it, and then deny you the right to travel based on their subjective assessment felt incredibly invasive. It felt fundamentally un-American. But the sheer volume of blood on the asphalt quickly silenced the loudest critics. State governments slowly realized they had stumbled upon a golden opportunity. By testing drivers, they could assert total, unquestioned control over the public roadways. They could legally monopolize the right to travel, transforming it from a fundamental freedom into a highly regulated privilege. And crucially, by making the testing process mandatory, they could significantly increase the fees and taxes associated with getting the paperwork. Following New Jersey's groundbreaking 1913 mandate, the concept of the mandatory driving test began to slowly creep its way across the American landscape. But if you think this was some overnight, universally welcomed revolution in public safety, you would be completely wrong. In fact, it was a long, dragging, agonizingly slow process of government expansion, actively battling against fierce, deeply rooted local independence. Throughout the roaring 1920s and the turbulent 1930s, as massive paved highways were constructed across the country, and automobiles suddenly became capable of doing 60 miles per hour, several states still flatly refused to test their drivers. They viewed the driving test not as a necessary safety measure, but as a profound, unforgivable insult to a citizen's basic autonomy. The ultimate holdout in this decades-long war over the steering wheel, the absolute final frontier of uninhibited American driving freedom, was the rugged state of South Dakota. While the rest of the country eventually fell in line with the new bureaucratic order, South Dakota adamantly refused to implement a mandatory driver's license requirement for a shockingly long time. The residents there, many of whom were generational farmers and ranchers, argued that if a man needed to drive his pickup truck into town to sell his grain and feed his family, the federal or state government had absolutely zero constitutional right to stop him, test him, or tax him for that basic economic necessity. They held their ground year after year, decade after decade. It was not until 1954, that is more than half a century after Massachusetts issued the first paper licenses, and right at the dawn of the modern, high-speed interstate highway system, that South Dakota finally caved to overwhelming federal pressure and officially required its citizens to be licensed. With South Dakota's submission, the net was finally closed. Every single American was now required to carry a piece of government-issued identification to operate a vehicle. But as the mid-20th century rolled on, the driver's license underwent a quiet, incredibly insidious transformation. It slowly stopped being a simple certificate of driving competence and morphed into something much darker and far more pervasive. To see how absurd this shift really is, think about what happens when you turn 16 or 17 in the United States today. You go down to a depressing DMV office, you take a relatively simple multiple-choice test on a computer screen, you parallel park a sedan in an empty lot, and boom, the state grants you a plastic license. And then, you never have to actually prove your physical driving skills ever again. You can legally drive a massive metal machine for the next 60 years. As your eyesight inevitably fades, as your physical reflexes slow down to a crawl, and as complex traffic laws completely change, the state will just blindly renew your license in the mail as long as you pay the $40 fee and occasionally take a new photograph. Does that sound like a system deeply obsessed with roadway safety? If the license was truly, genuinely about protecting the public and making sure the person behind the wheel is actually a competent operator, wouldn't we logically have to retake the physical driving test every 5 or 10 years? But we do not do that. And the reason we do not do that is the exact thing most people completely miss about the modern DMV. By the late 20th century, the government had a profound realization. Because American society had been structurally designed in a way that made owning a car virtually mandatory for survival, practically every single adult citizen eventually needed to get a driver's license. It was the absolute perfect Trojan horse for a de facto national ID card. It quietly became the singular document you need to open a checking account at a bank, the card you must show to board a commercial airplane, the proof you need to buy a beer at a local bar, and the exact physical item a police officer demands to identify you during a routine traffic stop. What started in 1903 as a simple $2 paper receipt to pay for road repairs has expanded into a massive, multi-billion-dollar apparatus of total state surveillance and citizen compliance. Look at the modern Real ID Act passed by Congress in 2005. The federal government officially mandated that state driver's licenses must include machine-readable technology, tying your identity directly into sweeping national databases. The plastic card in your wallet today is no longer just a legal permission slip to turn a steering wheel. It is a highly sophisticated tracking device containing a high-resolution photograph of your face, your exact home address, your height, your weight, your eye color, and an encrypted barcode. It was all heavily disguised as a necessary safety measure to stop highway accidents, but it ultimately built the perfect infrastructure to monitor a population. The transition was so incredibly gradual, spanning from Henry Bliss's tragic death to the high-tech DMV databases of the 2020s, that nobody ever really stopped to ask if we had traded our fundamental freedom of movement for the mere illusion of total security. When you trace this entire tangled history back to the very first paper tags issued in 1903, the sheer irony of the situation becomes almost suffocating. The driver's license was absolutely born out of a genuine, bloody crisis. The cobblestone streets of early 20th century America were soaked in the blood of innocent pedestrians like Henry Bliss, and society desperately needed a fast, effective way to tame the roaring metallic beasts that were suddenly tearing through their quiet neighborhoods. But in our frantic, terrified attempt to strictly regulate the machine, we inadvertently ended up permanently regulating the citizen. We willingly surrendered the ancient fundamental human right of free movement, a liberty that defined the American spirit for over a century, and we quietly replaced it with a highly conditional privilege, a privilege strictly granted by the state, which can be legally revoked at any given moment for any number of administrative reasons. The modern driver's license today is fundamentally not a diploma of your physical skill behind the wheel. We have already established that you can hold one for 6 decades without ever proving your reflexes again. Instead, it operates entirely as a receipt of your absolute compliance. It proves, in cold, hard data, that you have paid your required state fees, officially registered your physical identity, and fully submitted yourself to the expansive jurisdiction of the modern system. We look back at the people of 1899, blindly driving highly dangerous, untested machinery into chaotic streets with absolutely no training, and we naturally think they were completely crazy. It seems utterly barbaric to us now. But imagine if you could bring a farmer from 1903 into the present day. Maybe they would look at us, willingly handing over our sensitive biometric data to federal databases, paying recurring annual taxes for the basic right to travel down the road, and peacefully accepting a system where a single small piece of plastic dictates our entire ability to participate in society and commerce. And maybe, just maybe, that farmer would look at the modern commute and think that we are the crazy ones. So, the next time you pull out your leather wallet to show your identification to a clerk or a police officer, just take a few seconds to really look at that little plastic card. It holds your face, your exact home address, and a scannable barcode containing your life's details. You have to ask yourself a very uncomfortable question. Is this piece of plastic actually doing anything to protect you from the millions of terrible, distracted drivers currently sharing the road? Or is it simply a highly evolved tool, designed over a century, strictly protecting the system from you? If this deep dive completely changed how you view the everyday things sitting in your wallet, hit that subscribe button. We specialize in peeling back the layers of history that you were never taught in school, exposing the weird, wild, and sometimes unsettling origins of the systems that quietly control our lives today. Drop a comment below and let us know. Do you think everyday drivers should be forced to retake their road tests every 5 or 10 years? Or is the government already way too involved in our daily commute? Thanks for watching, and we will see you in the next one.